The Civil Rights Movement, Part 1. When studying the Civil Rights Movement, we need to first ask ourselves why the Civil Rights Movement for African Americans began when it did. It was for a number of reasons. For one thing, during World War II, quite a few African American troops served overseas, and they came home with rising hopes for what their lives could be like in the United States. They had served their country admirably and seen the world, and they came home, as I said, with rising hopes. Also, there was a growth of an urban middle class. There were black communities in cities, particularly after the world wars had resulted in a mass migration. Not only was there a sense of community solidarity, but this also gave rise to groups like the NAACP, and the black church would also play a critical role in the civil rights movement. Another factor that you might not think of at first is communism. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were both attempting to win over third world countries, and the communists used this argument against us. They told third world countries in Africa, "You don't want to follow the lead of the United States. Do you know how they treat people of color like you?" In response to this, some leaders of the United States realized that we needed to address racial relations in order to win the Cold War in African nations. I want to divide the civil rights movements into three major areas of focus. First of all, we'll talk about the public school system, segregation in education. Secondly, we'll talk about segregation throughout the rest of society. Thirdly, we'll focus on political rights, namely voting. First of all, segregation in education. In the 1890s, the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson had ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. In fact, black and white schools had not been equal by any stretch of the imagination, but in theory, it was okay to have black students and white students separated as long as they each had their supposedly equal schools to attend. But in 1954, in the Brown v. Board of Education case, the Supreme Court reversed itself. The court stated that separate but equal was fiction, that aside from tangible factors like schools, textbooks, desks, and teachers, there were also intangible factors, things you can't see or touch. The simple fact that black students were told, "You are different, therefore you must be separated," the court said that was inherently unequal treatment. So when the Supreme Court handed down this ruling, they also ruled that desegregation of public schools must be carried out with all deliberate speed. They were leaving states the responsibility to execute the ruling. Throughout the South, there was a massive resistance to desegregating the schools. There were several well-known incidents, particularly the one in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the governor himself, Governor Faubus, attempted to interfere with desegregation. What about the rest of society besides public schools? In 1955 was the Montgomery bus boycott. This was not the first such boycott, but it certainly came to be one of the more famous events of the civil rights movement. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus for a white man, which had been the tradition, African Americans always had to sit in the back of the bus and would always have to move and give up their seat for a white person. So when she resisted, she did so with a premeditated plan. Parks was working with the NAACP, and her actions sparked a grassroots boycott of the public transit system, which eventually was successful in bringing about change. Another prominent leader of the civil rights movement, of course, was Martin Luther King Jr. He was involved in the Montgomery boycott, and he was also instrumental in organizing the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He worked with other African American ministers in organizing black churches to participate in the civil rights movement. There were also groups that fought for change in other ways. One example is the SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In the 1960s, one popular form of nonviolent protest was sit-ins. The sit-in strike in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960 was one good example. At these sit-ins, African Americans would sit down at a lunch counter at an establishment that would only serve whites at the counter, and they refused to give up their seats until they were served. This first attracted a great deal of attention as well as tension, but it eventually did lead to changes there as well. There were also the Freedom Riders, who were a group of young college students from the North, both white and black, who took bus tours through the South. They tested the desegregation of public transportation, making sure that not only on paper, but actually in reality, desegregation was being carried out. This was, of course, very dangerous, as many in the South resented what they saw as interference from outsiders. Restrictive covenants were also in use at this time. There are different reasons why whites and blacks very often lived in segregated neighborhoods. Part of it likely being due to economic inequality. Some could afford neighborhoods that others could not, and partly due to choice, preferring to live in segregated neighborhoods. But when it came to restrictive covenants, even if a white person wanted to sell their home to a black family, a restrictive covenant, if it were in place, would prevent them from doing so in order to keep the community a white community. What about political rights? As we saw at the beginning of the semester, the 15th Amendment provided that no person could be denied the right to vote because of their color. But we know that there were ways around the 15th Amendment. Southern states had effectively disfranchised African Americans, for example, with poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. So although the right already existed legally, it was not being carried out, at least not on a large scale. Some activists in the civil rights movement focused on this problem, voting rights. In 1963, the March on Washington attracted the attention of national leaders, as well as people throughout the nation. This was the occasion of Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In the summer of '64, Freedom Summer, young college students, many of them white Northern students, the same group which had participated in the Freedom Rides before, came down to the South in order to register more African American voters, voter registration drives. In 1965, the Civil Rights Act, or Voting Rights Act, was passed, which provided for greater enforcement of the promise of the 15th Amendment. I like to divide the civil rights movement not only into these three areas of focus, but also into two time periods. If we were to identify a transition point between the first wave of the civil rights movement and the second wave, we might point to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Many things changed after that point. King, of course, had always taught nonviolent protest. In his "I Have a Dream" speech, there's an emphasis on peace and harmony. But another civil rights movement leader, Malcolm X, had a different approach to achieving civil rights for African Americans. He led the Black Power movement in separatism and accepting violence, suggesting that the white enemy was using violence against them and they should be able to fight fire with fire in order to bring about change. That doesn't mean that after King's assassination, the civil rights movement as a whole turned to Malcolm X's acceptance of violence. There was a split within the civil rights movement. Many of King's followers went on practicing nonviolent protest just as before, so there was division within the ranks. There was also a change when it came to urban riots in the North. Before, the civil rights movement had focused on the South, but later in the 1960s it moved into northern cities. The Detroit riot was one such example. There was also division as the movement moved along over the goals and the extent of the civil rights movement. One example is busing. Now, technically, there is a difference between desegregation and active integration. The Supreme Court had ordered the desegregation of schools, meaning that schools could no longer bar black students from attending with white students. But some in the civil rights movement thought that it was necessary to go a step farther and through busing actively ensure that white and black students attended schools together. Others, also within the civil rights movement, who certainly hated segregation, disagreed with this approach. There weren't only white Americans who were opposed to busing, sometimes on racist grounds, but activists in the civil rights movement also sometimes opposed this approach. Affirmative action is another example. Some members of the civil rights movement over time believed that affirmative action was necessary to ensure that African Americans got educational and job opportunities in more equal numbers. Others, also within the civil rights movement, disagreed with this approach. So, over time, the civil rights movement experienced more and more division over goals and over tactics. As we'll see, as other groups later on use the example of the African American civil rights movement, there would be yet more division over the meaning of civil rights.